Nosotros empezar ahora con el alfabeto de español. We're going to start with the alphabet in Spanish today, and we're going to talk about some of the similarities between Spanish and English as well to help you learn the Spanish alphabet or the English alphabet. It helps to know the sounds of each letter and how they differ in their spelling and their phonetics. So we're going to start with letra A. The letra A is the same in Spanish as it is in English. They both make the same sound. You might hear a slight difference in Spanish versus English. When the letra A is used, it could be A as well. Depends on the dialect and the region. Letra B sound, instead of making the B sound in English, it's B. Letra C. In the English language, it can mean k, pero in the Espanol, in Spanish, it's almost similar to an S sound. Letra D. These two are very similar in both Spanish and in English because the letter D in English is a d sound versus the letter in Spanish makes it de sound. Letra A. This is where many students get confused. Letra A and letra A sound very similar, pero one is Spanish and one is English. The letter A in Spanish has the same sound as the letter E in Spanish. Letra F. In English, our sound is used with the F, but in Spanish, it is pronounced F. It sounds like it has an E before the actual F itself. Our letter G is more like a H sound. It does not have the firm g sound as it does in English. It has more of an H sound if you think about it. So, H, our letra H is H. Lo siento. H. You notice a difference. I don't know if you can notice a difference, but the difference is that in English, our letters are not spelled out. Our letters are simply, there's a sound attached to them, but they're not spelled out like as in H. H, when we are speaking of the letter H, is an actual word to describe the letter itself. In English, the H has a sound, but in Spanish, it's a very deep and pronounced H sound. E. This is another misused letter in the Spanish alphabet because in English, it sounds like R-E, but it is actually pronounced E when it comes to an I in Spanish. J is another one that has a spelling attached to it. In Spanish, this is jota. And the J is primarily silent in the Spanish language versus the English language, where the J almost mimics the sound of a G. Okay? Or in Spanish, pronounced ka. In English, it is the sound of a k sound, which confuses many people because our C in English and our K in English sound very similar. But this is another one in Spanish where this is more of a silent letter, even if it's in a word. It's silent versus it's a very strong letter, C and K, in the English word. For example, jack and cat. Those are very strong syllabus sounds from the letters themselves. L or L. This is a very similar one to English. This is a letter that has very many similarities because it has a strong, very pronounced L sound. But in English, the L is more silent than in Spanish. M. In most cases, in English and in Spanish, the M sounds very much the same. Our M in English has a very strong pronounced m sound. And in Spanish, the same thing applies. Moscata, moscato. That M still has a very strong sound, just as in milk in English. They both have the same emphasis put on them. Okay, let's go over here. Sorry, we're going to do the N over here. N. Now in English, our N is a very, it's more of a silent letter versus in Spanish, a simple N can make the difference in pronunciation. For example, we have the word end. When you hear a little bit of the N versus in a Spanish word, enseñar, that N is more pronounced in most Spanish words than it is in the English words. O. This is usually a pretty easy one for English speakers and Spanish speakers alike, because O has the same sound pretty much in English and in Spanish. The O has a O sound either way, but the same thing for an O. If this O has an accent above it, which they don't in English, but in Spanish they do, it can change the word drastically from lavo to lavo. It changes drastically there as well in Spanish. P. Our P's are very cute, very close to being the same, because our P in English, paper, has a p sound, and in Spanish, papel. It has the same, doesn't sound exactly the same, but you know how to recognize a P in either English and in Spanish. So we got Q. This one has a different spelling. The Q in Spanish actually is spelled C-U, and that's because the Q is very close to our K in English. And in fact, there's a word K in Spanish, and it sounds like it would begin with a K, and that can confuse a lot of people as well. But it is just a Q in front of the word, and it's actually spelled out. So that can cause a little misconfusion for those who have trouble with our commonly misunderstood letters such as K and C and Q, because they sound so much alike, but they are different letters and have different sounds overall in the Spanish language. R. This is another letter that we have. And in Spanish, this letter can make a difference in the pronunciation of a word. And in English, you barely would hear it in some words such as air, or such as gender. You barely hear that R sound. But in a Spanish word, you hear that in many words, and with an enunciation on it, it can be a very powerful sound. Amor. S. This is another word, this is another letter that causes people confusion, because in different dialects, the letter S can be pronounced as a sound, especially in Spain. But it is comes across in areas around here as a sound. So this can cause confusion. If you're not sure of which one it is, you have to pay attention to how it is spelled or how it sounds to you. Okay? Our T's are very similar between both alphabets. Our T's both have a t sound, but in Spanish, sometimes the T's can be silent or very minimally noticed. In English, if you say tag, it's very obvious we have a T sound. But if in Spanish you say the word este, you hear a very, very minimal usage of it in the word, and it's not as pronounced. So we got U, and that is you in the English language. And this letter is another one that it doesn't have an sound like the English version. It has more of a sound to it. The difference between tug and a word doble. It's the same difference. They have a different sound and a different meaning when used in that different context. Okay, so we got be. Now I'm sure you're thinking, be. That sounds like our b sound in English. But when you think of be, you think of a B in English. But it's actually a V in Spanish. And V is another one that comes across, it doesn't match its look. You would think a verb such as envolver would have a more pronounced V sound, but it doesn't. It comes out envolver. Sounds more like there's a B. So this can cause confusions for other people as well, because it has a sound just like the B up here in English. Okay, now we have doble B. Doble B, if you can think of it this way, doble B, doble is double, B is V. So if you put these two together, you would come out with a W in the English language. Now in English, our W has a very strong was sound, versus our Spanish version of this doesn't. It's a very light sound when you're using it in the Spanish language as well. This one doesn't seem to cause any issues, but it can be very similar to the sound of the other one. Okay, now we got X. Now this is another word another letter where we spell it out into a word to pronounce what we're using. And X, the X is a silent letter within the Spanish alphabet as well. It is not one that is used very commonly. Our X has a very definitive X sound. It has a very pronounced sound. But the X in Spanish is very light. It doesn't exude in most of the letters. It doesn't come across as the X strong sound we have in English. Okay, and we have Y. Y is another one that can be confusing because our Y in the English language does have a strong sound. By. Our Y has a very strong sound. But in Spanish, the Y is very, very silent. It's not used with any emphasis usually. Here's another one that our last one for the day is zeta. Now to you, and I'm sure you're wondering, the zeta sounds like an S. So this can cause issues if you are used to hearing the S sound in the English language. And in Spanish, our Z, the Z is not pronounced with the S sound. Most of the time it's with the F sound, just like the S. So it can be confusing on spelling. So we have to remember that in English and in Spanish, there are similarities between the alphabets and in the sounds. And so we have to continually practice these different sounds and learn these different letters and know what they each mean to understand what a word is in Spanish. Now I'm going to offer some tips and tricks for students that need help with some cognates. So raise your hand if you know what a cognate is. Okay, so a cognate is a word that looks like another word in the Latin-based languages. And so in English, we have words that are very much like the words in English. And that's because the Latin-based languages tend to have words that are very similar. So here are some tricks to remember different words that have similar meanings, but you also have to watch for false cognates as well. So we have a word in English, sympathetic. I'm sorry. Sympathetic. And in Spanish, we have a word, simpático. And can you tell the likeness of these two words? They're alike, huh? They look the same, they're kind of spelled the same, but guess what? They have different meanings. Different meanings. This word here means to be caring and considerate of others. Whereas simpático in Spanish is more like a kind and a nice person. Now you say they're close. They are very close, but they're different as far as describing people and different things. Another one that you could say is very close to an English word could be, what's another one? Horrible. That looks very similar to the horrible, doesn't it? It's even spelled the same. Horrible and horrible. They have different pronunciations. Horrible. Horrible. The difference is it's important to remember that even though they're spelled the same, they have different sounds and they have different pronunciations. So we have to continually work on that. One is terrible, and one is horrible. This is one of those cognates that you can use to help you when you're reading something and you want to compare the languages. Because in Spanish, horrible means horrible. And in English, horrible can mean terrible. All right, so guys, that's the end of our lesson today. I hope you learned some new things about the alphabet and the likes and dislikes between the two languages. And I hope that you learned something new and new tricks to help you as you read and learn the new language.